April 2022. A team crouches inside a rock shelter high in the Blue Mountains, less than 100 kilometers west of Sydney. The cave opens like an amphitheater cut into sandstone, wide enough to hold 40 people, its ceiling blackened by thousands of years of smoke. Below the entrance, ridgelines fall away into eucalyptus forest. Above, nothing but cold sky and the faint remains of a trail that has been walked for longer than any written record on this continent. Dr. Amy Way, an archaeologist holding a joint position at the Australian Museum and the University of Sydney, runs a trowel through compacted sediment near the base of the excavation. They are almost 2 meters down. The layer is sandy, flecked with charcoal, and it sits against a reddened patch of earth that looks like the footprint of a fire. Weeks later, the radiocarbon results will come back from the laboratory. The date attached to that charcoal will read approximately 20,000 years before present. And that single number will dismantle a model that Australian archaeology had operated under for the better part of half a century. This is the story of Dargan Shelter. And what makes it significant is not simply that it is old. It is that the evidence was always here, in a cave that Aboriginal people never forgot, waiting for Western science to bring the right question to the right place. For decades, the consensus on Australia's high country during the Ice Age was blunt and confident. The mountains were a barrier, full stop. During the Last Glacial Maximum, the period roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, when global ice sheets reached their greatest extent, the eastern highlands of southeastern Australia were considered effectively uninhabitable above a certain elevation. Not merely difficult, not merely risky, off-limits to sustained human presence. The reasoning made intuitive sense. Temperatures in the upper Blue Mountains were at least 8 degrees Celsius colder than they are today. That is not a subtle shift. 8 degrees in a mountain environment transforms the landscape. The tree line dropped hundreds of meters. At 1,000 meters elevation, you were well above it. No trees meant no firewood. No firewood meant no warmth, no cooked food, no way to process the few edible plants that might survive a tundra winter. Water sources froze solid. The terrain was open, windswept, and barren. Pollen cores drilled from nearby sediments confirmed what the temperature data implied. Pull a core from the LGM layers, and what you see under the microscope is a landscape stripped bare. No eucalyptus pollen, no acacia, just grasses, mosses, low scrub. The kind of ground cover you find in sub-Antarctic islands, not in a mountain range 100 kilometers from Sydney. If you stood at Dargan Shelter 20,000 years ago and looked out, you would see treeless ridgelines fading into gray sky. Nothing to burn, nothing to eat, nothing, according to the textbooks, worth staying for. So the models told a tidy story. Aboriginal people, who had occupied the broader Blue Mountains and Sydney Basin for more than 30,000 years, adapted to the cold by retreating to lower ground. River valleys, coastal plains, sheltered lowland corridors. The high country was abandoned during the worst of the glacial period and reoccupied only after temperatures began to rise again thousands of years later. It was a sensible model. It was supported by the available evidence. And for a long time, nobody had much reason to challenge it. The available evidence. That phrase is doing enormous work in that sentence, and it is worth pausing on. Before Dargan Shelter, the earliest accepted evidence for human occupation above 700 meters anywhere in Australia dated to approximately 14,500 years ago. That is 5,000 years after the coldest phase of the Ice Age had already passed. Every confirmed LGM occupation site in southeastern Australia, from Tasmania to the Australian Alps, sat below the periglacial zone, the altitude threshold above which seasonal freezing and thawing dominate the landscape. There was one outlier. A site called King's Table, also in the Blue Mountains, produced a basal radiocarbon date of 22,300 years before present. On paper, that would have challenged the barrier model directly. But the margin of error was vast, plus or minus 1,900 years. Multiple scholars, including Sandra Bowdler and Ian Johnson, publicly questioned whether the date was reliable. The archaeological community largely set it aside. King's Table became a footnote, not a turning point. And this is where the mechanism of error locks into focus. Once the high country was classified as empty during the Ice Age, no one went looking for evidence that it was not. Excavation budgets are finite. Logistical challenges are real. Hauling equipment to 1,000 meters is harder than working at sea level. Funding bodies allocate resources to sites where results are expected, and expectations are shaped by existing models. The absence of evidence became, quietly and without anyone declaring it, evidence of absence. The question stopped being asked, and a question that stops being asked is a question that cannot be answered. This self-reinforcing cycle persisted for decades. Frederick McCarthy, the Australian Museum's first university-trained archaeologist, began work in the Blue Mountains in the 1930s. He built the institutional foundation, published extensively on rock art and tool assemblages, and catalogued hundreds of sites. After him came Professor Paul Tacon, who in the early 2000s worked alongside Wayne Brennan, a Gomeroi knowledge holder and rock art specialist, to survey shelters in the Wollemi region of the Greater Blue Mountains. Dr. Val Attenborough continued the tradition, reanalyzing key collections with updated methods. Each generation expanded the record, but the excavation effort remained concentrated at lower elevations. The upper ridgelines, the high shelters above the periglacial limit, were not actively investigated, not because anyone deliberately avoided them, but because the prevailing model said there was nothing there to find. Wayne Brennan did not accept that model. The Dharug community did not accept that model. Multiple Aboriginal groups with connections to the Blue Mountains, including the Wiradjuri, Darawal, Gomeroi, Wanarua, Ngunnawal, Darkinjung, and Gundungara, maintain deep ties to this landscape stretching back tens of thousands of years. Their oral traditions speak of movement through the mountains, of gathering places, of ceremony, of routes that crossed the high country deliberately, not as a last resort, but as part of a living cultural system. Brennan, who is also a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, initiated the Dargan Shelter project specifically to merge scientific excavation with First Nations knowledge. He chose this particular cave because of its position on a known Aboriginal traveling route along the Bells Line of Road ridgeline, its high elevation, and its potential to hold deep, undisturbed deposits. The site selection was not accidental. It was guided by exactly the kind of knowledge that the barrier model had ignored. The team began excavating in April 2022. Dr. Way led the fieldwork, with Professor Philip Piper of the Australian National University as second author. The crew included university students from the University of Sydney and ANU, community members, and Dharug custodians, Leanne Watson-Redpath and Aaron Wilkins, who are co-authors on the published paper. The Wagana dancers opened the work with a lyrebird dance. This was not a sterile project parachuted in from a distant institution. From the first trowel stroke, it was collaborative. Over 3 field seasons spanning 2022 and 2023, the team removed sediment down to bedrock. Maximum depth, 2.3 meters. Every artifact was plotted in 3 dimensions using survey equipment. All excavated sediment was sieved at 7 millimeters and again at 3 millimeters to recover even the smallest flakes, the thin slivers of stone that chip off when a tool is being shaped or sharpened. What emerged from the ground was not a thin, ambiguous scatter of maybe evidence. It was a dense, layered, undeniable record of human activity. 693 stone artifacts. Multiple hearths preserved in situ, charcoal-rich layers with ash and reddened earth confirming fire use over and over. 117 of those stone flakes came from stratigraphic layers older than 16,000 years. And at the base of the deposit, the lowest artifacts sat beside a hearth that radiocarbon dating placed at 21,700 to 19,990 calibrated years before present. That is the coldest window of the Ice Age, the exact period when this cave was supposed to be empty. Pollen analysis added another dimension. Samples from the deepest layers showed exactly what the climate models predicted: treeless, tundra-like vegetation, grasses, mosses, no canopy. But as the sequence moved upward through time, toward the end of the Pleistocene and into the Holocene, the pollen shifted. Woodlands returned, trees recolonized, the landscape greened. And through all of it, the artifacts continued. The occupation timeline stretches from 20,000 years ago to as recently as 330 years ago. People did not arrive when conditions improved. They were already there when conditions were at their worst, and they stayed through the entire transformation. The stratigraphy was immaculate. Think of it as a vertical calendar compressed into 2.3 meters of earth. Each layer of sediment represents a window of time, and the contents of that layer, the charcoal, the ash, the stone flakes, the reddened, fire-stained earth, tell you what happened during that window. The integrity of the sequence depends on nothing being moved, no burrowing, no root action pushing artifacts between layers, no water washing material from one depth to another. At Dargan, the team recovered over 20 radiocarbon dates spanning the entire depth, and not a single inversion. Every layer was in proper chronological order, oldest at the bottom, youngest at the top. No mixing, no disturbance. This matters enormously because in Australian archaeology, stratigraphy is frequently the weak link. Sandy deposits, common across the continent, are notoriously vulnerable to disturbance. Dargan's sediments held firm. Dylan Davis, a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, described the number and quality of the radiocarbon dates as quite impressive, noting that preservation quality is often the severe limiting factor in making definitive claims from the archaeological record. At Dargan, that limitation did not apply. The continuous, unbroken sequence makes it one of the most robust chronologies for any high-altitude site in the Southern Hemisphere. But dates alone do not tell you who came here, or from where, or how far they traveled to reach this frozen ridgeline. That answer came from geochemistry. Emily Nutman, a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, placed the stone artifacts under an X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. Picture a machine that interrogates rock the way a forensics lab interrogates a blood sample. High-energy X-rays hit the stone, and each chemical element inside it fires back a unique signal, a fluorescent signature that identifies exactly what the rock is made of and, crucially, where it came from. Different geological formations carry different elemental fingerprints. Match the fingerprint on a tool to the fingerprint at an outcrop, and you have traced a human journey that left no other record. It is geological forensics. And at Dargan, it cracked open a story that the stone tools alone could not tell. If this kind of detective work is something you want to follow as we trace more of these ancient networks, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss what comes next. Most of the tools at Dargan were made from local materials, quartz and claystone sourced from the surrounding landscape, practical, expedient, shaped on site. But some tools were not local. A black quartzite hammerstone, recovered from a layer dated to 15,000 years ago, matched the chemical signature of river pebbles found in the Hunter Valley, approximately 150 kilometers to the north. Other stone fragments were consistent with sources near Jenolan Caves, about 50 kilometers to the southwest. 150 kilometers, through mountain ranges, during an ice age, with no trees for shelter and temperatures 8 degrees below modern norms. That is not someone stumbling into a cave by accident. That is a network. People moving from the north, from the Hunter Valley. People moving from the south, from the Genelan region, meeting in the high country at a specific rock shelter on a known route. Brennan described Dargan to The Guardian as a guest house on the way to a ceremony place. That framing, coming from a Gomeroi knowledge holder with decades of rock art research behind him, is not metaphor. It is cultural memory operating across a time span that Western archaeology has only just confirmed. So what does this evidence show? What does it rule out? And what does it force us to reconsider? First, it shows repeated occupation over thousands of years. This was not a single desperate camp used once during a brief warm spell. Artifact density peaked between 18,000 and 16,000 years ago. People kept returning. They built fires, worked stone, maintained tools. A sandstone grinding slab dated to roughly 13,000 years ago had 2 linear grooves worn into its surface, consistent with prolonged use shaping bone or wooden implements, needles, awls, bone points, the kind of fine tools that require skill, patience, and a reason to stay long enough to make them. A basalt anvil from the early Holocene layers, dating to approximately 9,000 years ago, showed circular impact marks from cracking hard woody nuts and seed shells. The cave was not just a waypoint, it was a workspace, a place people returned to with purpose across millennia. Second, it rules out the barrier model in the most direct way possible. If temperatures were 8 degrees colder, if there were no trees, if water froze solid in winter, and yet people were still here, repeatedly, carrying tools from 150 kilometers away, then the Eastern Highlands were not a wall. They were a corridor, a cold, demanding corridor. But a corridor that people deliberately chose to traverse as part of seasonal circuits tied to ceremony, trade, kinship, and resource access. Third, it implies something profound about planning and knowledge transmission. You do not carry a quartzite hammerstone 150 kilometers through frozen treeless terrain unless you know where you are going, what you will find when you get there, and why the journey is worth making. That is not opportunistic foraging. That is logistical thinking. Root knowledge passed between generations. Mental maps of a landscape that looked nothing like it does today. And there is the rock art. Faded but unmistakable. A child-sized hand stencil pressed into the shelter wall. 2 forearm stencils. Art in a cave 1,000 meters above sea level, above the Ice Age tree line. Children were brought here. Dargan Shelter does not exist in isolation. Across other continents, researchers have been quietly and independently revising the same blind spot. In the Bale Mountains of Ethiopia, excavations documented Middle Stone Age foragers living at high elevation during glacial periods, their tools and hearths preserved in sediments above 4,000 meters. On the Tibetan Plateau, human occupation was pushed back to between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago, rewriting assumptions about when anyone could survive at extreme altitude. In inland Spain, the Charco Verde II site documented Magdalenian period occupation during the LGM in harsh upland conditions, with people making complex stone tools in environments that were supposed to be empty. In central Mexico, evidence of human presence near the Last Glacial Maximum was published in Nature in 2020, placing people at high elevation in the Americas far earlier than most models predicted. None of these research groups were working from the same starting point. They were excavating different continents, different time periods, different cultural traditions. But they all arrived at the same conclusion, and that convergence is what gives this pattern its weight. Each finding challenged the identical assumption that cold, high-altitude landscapes were natural barriers to human movement. Dargan Shelter brings Australia into this global pattern for the first time. Every inhabited continent now has confirmed evidence of people living in periglacial environments during or near the coldest phases of the Pleistocene. The wall was never a wall. Not in Australia, not anywhere. But this does not mean every question about Australia's human past is settled. If anything, Dargan Shelter sharpens the unresolved tensions rather than dissolving them. The broader debate over when humans first arrived on the continent remains genuinely open. Mad Bebe, a rock shelter in Arnhem Land, was dated in 2017 to approximately 65,000 years ago using optically stimulated luminescence, a method that determines when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight. That study, led by Chris Clarkson, was published in Nature and drew global attention. If correct, Mad Bebe would represent the oldest evidence of modern humans outside Africa. But the dating is contested, and the contest is substantive. Mad Bebe's sediments are sandy. Sandy deposits are vulnerable to post-depositional disturbance, meaning artifacts can migrate between layers through processes like trampling, root growth, or burrowing animals. If artifacts shift downward into older sediment, they appear older than they actually are. A 2025 paper by Jim Allen of La Trobe University and James O'Connell of the University of Utah, published in Archaeology and Oceania, made the case that genetic evidence constrains human arrival in Australia to under 50,000 years. Their argument rests on a specific finding. All modern non-African humans, including Aboriginal Australians, carry Neanderthal DNA from a single interbreeding event dated between 51,500 years ago and 43,500 years ago. If the ancestors of present-day Aboriginal people had to pass through Eurasia after that event, they could not have reached Australia 65,000 years ago. Most confirmed archaeological sites across Australia cluster between 43,000 and 54,000 years. Mad Bebe stands alone as the primary outlier. Dargan Shelter does not directly enter this debate. Its oldest dates are 20,000 years, not 65,000, but it contributes something the discipline badly needs: a case study in what confirmation actually looks like. Over 20 radiocarbon dates, 0 inversions, artifacts in undisturbed primary context, independent geochemical sourcing, pollen analysis documenting vegetation change, multiple converging lines of evidence all pointing to the same conclusion. This is the standard, and it exposes, by unavoidable comparison, how much of Australia's deep-time archaeology still rests on single dates, disputed methods, or incomplete sequences. The tension between Mad Bebe and the genetic evidence is real, and it will not be resolved by argumentation alone. It will be resolved by more digging, more sites, more independent dates, and crucially, by more projects like Dargan Shelter, where First Nations communities and academic researchers work together from the beginning, bringing different kinds of knowledge to the same landscape. There are thousands of rock shelters in the Blue Mountains. The vast majority have never been excavated. Many have never been formally surveyed. The Blue Mountains hold UNESCO World Heritage status, but that listing protects the region's remarkable biodiversity, its sandstone pagodas, its eucalypt forests, its canyon ecosystems with their ancient Wollemi pines clinging to gorges like relics from another era. There are no formal safeguards for Aboriginal cultural heritage within the current World Heritage Framework. The irony is difficult to miss. A landscape that has been continuously inhabited by human beings for at least 20,000 years, and possibly far longer, is protected for its trees and its animals, but not for the evidence of the people who shaped it. Watson Redpath, one of the Dharug custodians who co-authored the study, said it directly. Their people have walked, lived, and thrived in the Blue Mountains for thousands of years. They knew the cave was there. It was not lost. It was not forgotten. It was not hidden behind some impenetrable geological barrier. It was simply never examined through the lens that Western science demanded before it would believe what Aboriginal people already knew. The exact location of Dargan Shelter remains undisclosed. The research team and the Dharug community made that decision together to protect the site from disturbance. The artifacts will be returned to Dharug custodians, with an advisory committee determining whether they will be reburied or displayed. It is one of the few archaeological projects in Australia where every artifact is contractually guaranteed to come back to country. Somewhere along the ridgelines of the upper Blue Mountains, above the modern tree line, there are dozens of shelters that have never been opened. Each one is a sealed archive. Each one might hold hearths, tools, art, evidence of people who were supposed to be absent from a landscape they clearly never left. We are still digging, literally,